Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure for us from Flight Standards Directorate to be here. We intend to share with you some considerations that sometimes may be obvious, but some other times experience shows that they are not so obvious. We would like to share with you what we see from our perspective in maintenance and in operation when an STC is installed on an aircraft. And in order to help us during this presentation, we are considering using a practical example of an STC, which is an head-up display. There are several available on the market. And this will guide us through the different stages of our presentation. In first place, if there is no STC approval, it is not possible to use the equipment that is subject for the STC. And this is not because we are saying this, but this is in the rule in Part M. When the responsibilities of the owner for continuing airworthiness are spelled out, first point in the Part M, you read A1, aircraft is maintained in an airworthy condition, and any operational and emergency equipment fit is correctly installed and serviceable and clearly identified or clearly identified as unserviceable. So if we have to keep the equipment, the aircraft airworthy, and to make sure that the equipment is correctly installed and serviceable, then we are under the remit of Part M. In order to make sure that number 3 is true, that is, the airworthiness certificate of the individual aircraft remains valid. And then at the end, that the maintenance is performed in accordance with a maintenance program as further specified. As we are, in most of the cases, talking of commercial operation or even commercial air transport operation, the responsibilities of the owner are normally exercised not by an individual, but by an organization, which is the so-called CAMO, the Continuing Airworthiness Management Organization, which is the engine of continuing airworthiness. Again, here in Part M, you have the responsibilities of the CAMO that are clearly spelled out. I hope you are all familiar with this, and so I don't intend to go through them in detail. If not, please use this opportunity just to make yourself familiar with the importance of having a CAMO at the center of all engineering activities in an airline or in an operator. And now let's start our journey. From our perspective, we see the STC like an iceberg, where the emerged part, the visible one, is the approval of the STC, which is an activity done by EASA. There are further approvals involving the maintenance elements and the operational element that are falling under the responsibility of the national aviation authorities, or the local competent authority, as you want to call it. Maybe this element is not so known, but as we have continuous exchange with the authorities, we see that this element deserves some attention because they are not so easy to be dealt with. And as I promised you, we are looking at an head-up display. Normally, an head-up display is installed to improve the capability of an aircraft to operate under low visibility conditions, which means sometimes having an approval for low visibility operation. You can have an aircraft that can be upgraded from Cat 1 operation to Cat 2 or even Cat 3 operation. Normally, this approval ends up in the operational specification of the air operator certificate, meaning that the presence of the STC installed on an aircraft has not only an impact on the airworthiness certificate of the individual aircraft, but also has an impact on the operator's capability stipulated in the air operation certificate. And as preconditions, there are a number of steps that need to be gone through. Airworthiness approval, training and qualification of the crew, the procedure to use it, operational demonstration, update of MEL, and continuous monitoring of the equipment in terms of reliability. So all these elements normally need to be considered by the authority in its oversight program. So for the approval, I think it's quite simple. The change covered by the STC must have an airworthiness approval. Normally, if it is not approved, an operator will not consider to buy it, or it will make arrangements in order to have it approved before it is fully paid or installed. One thing I would like to make clear is that also the manufacturing of the change, you may have elements, must be covered by Part 21, meaning that must take place in an approved production organization. And the change itself or the elements composing the change need to be covered by an EASA Form 1 or an equivalent. So now we have our head-up display, which is approved and covered by an STC. We have a beautiful EASA piece of paper, and we need to install it on our aircraft. First thing to do is to go to a maintenance organization and have it installed. There must be installation instruction, and normally they are part of the approval package of the STC. And then at the end of the installation, there is a need for a certificate of release to service, which will also be reflected in an update of the aircraft records. Aircraft records are not only recording that the head-up display was installed at a certain date by a certain company, but probably that there was a supplement to the aircraft or rotorcraft flight manual explaining how it has to be used. In some cases, there are impacts on the weight and ballast records. The change may have an effect on the operational empty weight, and some of the elements maybe are allowed to be unserviceable for limited point of time, meaning that they have to be reflected in the minimum equipment list. Now, with the aircraft modified with our head-up display, the configuration of the aircraft that need to be maintained, their airworthy configuration, is changed. And the continuing airworthiness of the aircraft is not only what is dictated by the manufacturer, by the TC holder, but also what is dictated by the STC holder. And so you may have service bulletins or ADs applicable to this STC, and you need to decide on applicability and on embodiment. You may have malfunctions that need to be reported to the STC holder. And you may have some maintenance intervention that need to be done at regular intervals. That is, they need to be reflected in the approved maintenance program. And clearly, all these activities are, again, taking place in the CAMO, in the Continuing Airworthiness Management Organization, that is the part of the operator, that is looking after the continued airworthiness of the aircraft. So, and I now stop here for the maintenance part and give the floor to my colleague Edward for the operational consideration.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. Thank you for inviting us to your workshop. When it comes to operations, all these equipment are installed most of the times because they will give something back, and they will, most of them have operational implications. I think it's worth spending a few moments in understanding how the air operations rules are being designed from a regulatory perspective. Basically, there are three main drivers in determining the level of protection or the level of regulation when it comes to regulating air operations. The main driver, I would say, is the protection of passengers, and out of those, the protection of paying passengers. So therefore, the focus of our activities and the, let's say, the emphasis and intensity of our rules will concentrate very much on commercial air transport, the so-called CAT operations. The second dimension that is also used in determining the intensity of the regulations is the protection of third parties, of course. And an element that determines how much we regulate is also the complexity of the operation, which is also driven mostly by the complexity of the aircraft. I think was mentioned in the discussion previously regarding the master meld, where certain aircraft will fall under the category of complex aircraft or non-complex aircraft. Of course, they will be dealt with differently from a regulatory point of view. And to exemplify today what our spectrum of regulation comprises, in terms of technology, our rules, the so-called EASA rules, will cover let's say, the entire spectrum of technology, ranging from the most simple ones like sailplanes and balloons to the most complex one, the A380s and the A350s of this world. But we also differentiate in terms of the type of activities those aircraft are engaged with. At the very top of the list is, as I mentioned, the commercial air transport, CAT operations, your airlines or your charter operations, where those are required to hold an air operator certificate before they can engage in doing business, supplemented, if they need to be, by the so-called specific approvals. We'll discuss a bit later what those are. When it comes to non-CAT, our rules do not require organizational approvals in most of the cases. For example, when it comes to operations that are non-commercial, like business aviation or corporate aviation, that is regulated by Part NCC, we do not impose a form of a priori certification, but actually they will have to declare their competence and will be subject to oversight by the national aviation authorities. Only for those specific activities that require a specific approval, they would need to hold that approval before engaging in that type of operation. In terms of the approvals that the ops world is foreseeing, as we saw, we have a number of organizational approvals that are issued to the organization, and they attest the general capability of the organization to conduct that activity. The most prominent one is the Air Operator Certificate, which will allow an operator to seek to engage in conducting this type of operation. As opposed to other certificates issued like a Part 145 approval, this is not automatically a right to do business, because the Air Operator Certificate, which is looking at the safety side, has to be complemented by another approval that is called the Air Operating License. That is your right to access a certain market, and together will qualify an operator to do business or to transport cargo or passenger for remuneration in Europe. We also have the so-called specific approvals, which are a certain permission to conduct certain types of operation. And those specific approvals are designed based on higher complexity and therefore risk associated with those operations. And here we have in Europe today, RVSM. So in order to conduct operations in airspace where there's a reduced separation minimum at 1,000 feet, you need this specific approval. The question we are asking more and more is whether today we still need such an operating specific approval, where most of the upper airspace around the world is reduced minima. So an area that we will need to discuss further of its relevance from the ops side. High-level MNPS operations, or high-level airspace, that is now being renamed for the operations, for example, in North Atlantic airspace. PBN operations, where the agency has finalized 2 years back a very complex rulemaking task that is restructuring completely the number of specific approvals, therefore only requiring specific approvals for 2 particular cases. In case of the so-called RMP approaches with authorization required, so very complex approaches, mostly 3D. And one other specific approval is the operations with 0.3 accuracy conducted by helicopters. Other specific specific approvals that are required for ops are the so-called LVOs. We just touched upon when presented by Gian Andrea, so conducting operations at lower minima, Cat 2 and Cat 3 operations, where the use of equipment on board is a great enabler for, or a pre-required enabler for those type of operations. However, they are not sufficient in themselves. You need to consider a number of other aspects as mentioned in terms of operating procedure, training of crew, MEL consequences, and so on. ETOPS operations, so operations with twin engines, with extended diversion times, dangerous goods, and the new one we just introduced in Europe last year, operations at night or in IMC condition with single engine turbine when engaged in CAT operations. For helicopter operations, they are, of course, a bit different. We have a number of specific approvals in that area as well, especially addressing night operations with visual imaging systems, helicopter hoist operations, emergency medical services, and another one that will start in July this year about helicopter offshore operations. Another approval that is applicable in a very defined context is the so-called high-risk commercial specialized operations that are applicable for area work, as they are called by our rules, specialized operations. And some of them, defined at national level, require a prior approval from the national authorities. In all those cases, equipment plays a major role in obtaining such an approval, but is not the only one that will determine the issuance of such an approval. Procedures and training of crew and of personnel involved in this type of operations are equally important in order to obtain such an approval. From my side, as a conclusion, to operate a modification subject to an STC, you might need to consider that an OPS approval is required. The STC, the equipment, is indeed a precondition. However, in itself will not guarantee that the approval is issued automatically. And of course, the operator, since it has the direct line of engagement with its competent authority, has the obligation to ensure that all the other applicable requirements, be it on the maintenance side or on the operation side, are complied in order to safely operate the equipment. And as explained by Gian Andrea, when it comes to maintenance and especially ops approvals, these are prerogatives that today are with the member states. While the STC is issued by the agency, all the ops approvals today are issued by the member states. This might change, however, with the new basic regulation, which foresees in certain cases that the agency might also be given prerogatives of competent authority in the area of air operations as well. This is it from my side. Thank you very much. And should you have any questions, we are very happy to take them on board.
Actually, we have, yes, a forward to that question. I don't know who's the best to answer that, whether Gian Andrea or perhaps Ludovic, from our dear colleague Dominique Cortizo, and support from other participants. So how does the Part M organization now that a change to an STC or an STC was approved by EASA if it was originally one from the FAA but was classified basic as per the current TIP revision 6, there will be no involvement from EASA. So how does it work for a Part M organization? How do they make sure that it was really EASA approved?
Can you repeat the question? I didn't get it, sorry.
So there is an STC or a change to an STC, but it was actually not done originally by a European DOA, but by an American organization.
Okay.
It was classified basic as per the current TIP-Rev 6. Basic STC or basic change to an STC has no EASA involvement, so meaning there will be no EASA certificate.
Okay, so if no, I think in this case the CAMO has to make an evaluation. You need to know when an STC is needed and when it is not needed. So what we have in place are some provisions where the original approval issued by the FAA is directly applicable and recognized in Europe. This doesn't mean that the STC is not approved. This means that only from an administrative point of view, we take for good the approval issued by the FAA without the need to involve EASA again for a validation. So, but this belongs to certification procedure. In case of doubt, the best thing to do is to ask EASA, to ask our colleagues in the STC section, because they are those who can clarify whether an EASA STC is needed or not.
Okay, so there is no particular guideline for Part M organization, I understand.
Well, the guidelines are in AMC or GM to Part 21, so, and they are accessible to everyone. So the guideline for Part M is make sure that the change is approved.
So Angela, perhaps we can give the microphone to Dominique because I think he is not agreeing completely.
Hello. Hello. Yeah, the reason for the question is I've got mostly a certification background, but now working for CA UK, my role's changed a little bit. I'm getting much more involved in Part M. And when we're doing our surveys, audits of Part M organisations and ACAMs, we're finding that there is quite a bit of confusion within the Part M organisations as to whether or not FAA-approved changes are acceptable to EASA or not, because they are not familiar with Part 21. They're not familiar with the FAA EASA TIP Rev 6. So it's causing some confusion, and we're finding that some aircraft are being presented for ARC renewals or C of A with FAA STCs on them or changes out of the TC holder that should have been EASA approved.
So normally this kind of decision is made at EASA in the sense that EASA has published the criteria to automatically recognize some FAA STC. And then the CAMO is just making use of them. They are published on our website. I think they are in the FAQs, and then you can even dig further into the detailed documentation like TIP and so on. It is clear that at a certain point, the CAMO has to make a decision. Do I need an EASA STC or not? And if the answer is not straightforward, normally a good practice is to ask the local authority and to seek their point of view, which will normally be the right one. So then I am not able to answer a very specific case. I can just suggest a way of approaching the issue.
I understand your point. It's just a happy circumstance that I've been brought in, for example, because of my background in certification and Part M. When the Part Ms are asking the authority, like the CAA UK, they're asking my colleagues who know everything about Part M, but don't know very much at all about other matters of certification. So they're not in the best place to give the answer. Would it not be an idea to maybe have more connection, if you like, between different regulations in this sort of way, whether it's published on the ARSA website or not, so that people are completely clear?
Well, yes, I think so. You want?
So, Dominique, and all, because I think that many people share your concern, we will provide you a more comprehensive answer on that one later on. I think that, as you all know, the TIP Ref 6 is making a rupture compared to previous TIP revision. So we are still in the phase where we are maturing the implementation. So this deserves a more comprehensive answer to your question, and we'll come back to you afterwards. Yes. To all of you. Thank you very much.
So, Mr. Patrick Morer, I think we give you the floor directly because I'm not sure what you are covering in your question.
Yeah, I have one question on operational approval process because we find some examples where we have a gap between the airworthiness regulation and the operational approval regulation. If I give an example, we see on the market IFE, portable IFE systems with lithium batteries in it, with Wi-Fi capability, and we see clearly that there is a big gap between the airworthiness regulation, where we have to comply with ETSO for the batteries and so on, to show compliance on many aspects, and we have a portable IFE where you have very little demonstration to perform for operators. So we want to understand this gap and how it is handled by EASA and the national authorities.
Thank you for your question. Regarding this particular system, the IFE, you may know that there is an ongoing rule-making task now. Addressing this particular topic is more or less coming from the airworthiness side installation, but also includes a link and a bridge with the operations side in terms of consequences, especially when it comes to training of cabin crew and also other aspects. So that will be handled with that rule-making task. Otherwise, normally the ops rules will not go beyond those pieces of equipment that are required from an ops perspective. Not most of the time, IFE, it's a convenience item. It's there for the enjoyment of passengers and will carry very limited value from a regulatory safety perspective, unless it's being used to convey, for example, safety important messages in terms of cabin safety. But otherwise is not required by the ops rules. Therefore, the bridge will not be very strong in that aspect. But we will handle this via this rulemaking task that is on its short final to publish an I think an amendment AMC this year. So in that range.